Hi there, my name's Richard, and over the last year I've been building various helicopter models from the Falklands War, mostly Westland helicopters that served in the conflict. It kind of all started on a Facebook group called British Aviation Scale. They had a group build to commemorate the anniversary last year, and so I started making a Wessex HUM3 XP142, which is from 737 Squadron and was stationed on HMS Antrim. I think it was affectionately named Humphrey by the crew, and it was used in some of the first sort of missions around South Georgia. It was an escort for two Wessex HU5s that deployed some SAS troops onto the Fortuna Glacier. This mission didn't go according to plan, and the SAS troops had to be picked up shortly afterwards because the weather changed, and in the process of that, the two Wessex HU5s managed to crash into the ground. Luckily no one was killed, but Humphrey had to go back and pick up the rest of them in a couple of runs, I think, in bad weather, and managed to pick them all up. Shortly after that, it was hunting for the ARA Santa Fe, a submarine that the Argentines deployed to South Georgia, and it came across it as it was heading out and dropped two depth charges on it, causing it to not be able to dive, and it kind of turned around and headed back, limping back into Crichficken. The model that I've made is using the Revell Wessex Mark III, and I added a few bits and pieces to it. Plus I got some 3D printed depth charges and the pylons for it, and I painted it up as Humphrey. And this aircraft is preserved at the Fleet Air Arm Museum in Yeovilton. And then shortly after that, I made a Wasp HAS1, which was XS527. This was one of HMS Endurance's flight. They were painted in a sort of dark grey with a luminous red, which was obviously not going to be that useful in a war situation. So they were hastily painted in a camouflage scheme, and it was kind of hard to find decent pictures of the aircraft in the camouflage scheme. There's a few fairly blurry and distant shots of it, but I did come across some better shots whilst I was watching a talk by the pilot, and there were a few good shots that were very useful in working out what kind of colours it was. So the model that I've made, I had an old Airfix Scout which I'd started the Airwaves white metal conversion on probably about 20 odd years ago, which I rescued out of a box and decided to try and finish it off. Took a bit of work to get it up to speed and stuff, but again, adding various bits to it. I got some 3D printed AS-12 air surface missiles and the pylons, which I fitted to that. I also removed the front doors and added various other details to it to make it look accurate. Did it up in something that looks like the photo that I found of it in the camo scheme, but it's not 100% accurate. And then following on from the Wasp, I think I made a Lynx HAS2, which was XZ728 from 815 Squadron, which was stationed aboard HMS Broadsword. I think the Lynx is sort of moved around on the ships depending on different situations, but this one was a sea skewer armed one. And from photos that I'd found on HMS Broadsword Association website, I found pictures of one with a mad boom fitted, which was not that common. They didn't get used for a very long time after the conflict. I don't think they were as effective as maybe they'd hoped, but I wanted to try and make one with the mad boom, and I found a picture of one with two sea skewer missiles and assumed it was that aircraft. It might not be, but that's what I went for anyway. It's kind of more of a representation of what the Lynxes would have looked like at that stage, with the toned down markings. There's no particular story associated with this aircraft. It was just a bit of guesswork and something that represents the Lynx from that era. Following on from that, I made a Wessex HU5, which was XT480, and that was XQ, a part of B flight from 847 Squadron. And this was one of the hastily recreated squadrons at the time the conflict started, so it was taking aircraft from other squadrons, training units, etc., and was sort of part of the conflict later on. There's an iconic photograph of it when it was helping with the rescue from the Sir Galahad attack, where it was pushing life rafts with its downwash away from the ship and rescuing people from the water. This was quite a good read from someone that flew the Wessex during the conflict. I'd recommend that. There's other stories of different pilots from different squadrons, but it's primarily from a guy from 847 Squadron who I think was quite new to it all. He'd only recently got through his training. But yeah, that was an interesting read. Next, I made a Sea King HC4 ZA290, which was VC of 846 Squadron, and this was deployed to HMS Hermes and was one of, I think, about 5 that were issued with night vision goggles, which were new at the time of being tested, but hastily brought them into service to use for nighttime missions. And from the start of the conflict, they were inserting SAS and SBS teams to take part in reconnaissance around the Falkland Islands. This aircraft in particular is most famous for its aborted mission, which was going to take SAS troops to look at the comings and goings around the airfields in southern Argentina with a view to a special forces mission. It never happened in the end, and the mission itself to get the reconnaissance troops in didn't quite go according to plan. They dropped the troops off on the Argentine-Chilean border, and then they had to fly into Chile and landed on a beach and set fire to the aircraft and had to sort of hide for several days on the run until they finally gave themselves up to Chilean authorities and then eventually came home. This book is the story of that sort of mission in particular, and also the things leading up to that, including Pebble Island, etc. But this was a very interesting book, and I think the story has only recently sort of come to light, having sort of still been secret for quite a few years. So that's a good book to read. Next up was Sea King HAS2a XV700 64 of 825 Squadron. This was sent down on Atlantic Causeway. It was used later on in the war as an additional troop transport helicopter. The anti-submarine warfare equipment was removed and seating installed instead. And again, like the Wessex 5 that I've made, it was part of the rescue effort after the Sir Galahad attack. And again, there's an iconic photograph of it hovering at the rear of the ship, enveloped in smoke, rescuing people from the sea and moving life rafts away from the burning ship. But this aircraft, along with various other ones, was used in resupply missions in the latter part of the war. Following that Sea King, I made a third Sea King, a HAS5 ZA131, which was based on Hermes and part of 826 Squadron. There's not really any particular story with this, but it was part of the anti-submarine warfare protection for the fleet. The ARA San Luis was potentially around. They didn't know exactly until later on the submarine threat. I fitted this aircraft, which is the Revel Sea King, with the Mark 46 torpedo and depth charges, which were from Air Graphics. So this book is quite an interesting story about the anti-submarine warfare missions that took place during the Falklands conflict. It's probably a lesser known story than some of the others. I next made a Gazelle AH1, which was XX412 of Sea Flight 3 Commando Brigade Air Squadron. This travelled down on the Sir Galahad and I think was fitted with SNEB rockets at Ascension Islands on its way down, but I don't think these were actually ever used in anger during the conflict. The 2 other aircraft from this flight of 3 were lost on the first day of the amphibious landing. This aircraft, it was, I think, damaged by small arms fire, but carried on flying. And they were used primarily in the casualty evacuation and pathfinding missions. This particular aircraft, which is coded Y on the tail, took Colonel Michael Rose to Stanley on the 14th of June to begin surrender negotiations, and I think it was carrying a white flag underneath the fuselage as it flew to Port Stanley. And finally, the last one I made was a Scout AH1, and this was XT649 of 656 Squadron Army Air Corps. And this travelled south on the Europic ferry and then was transferred to the Elk when it became part of 5 Flight 3 Commando Brigade Air Squadron, encoded DN. The rest of 656 Squadron, I think, arrived later on. During the battle for Goose Green, Captain Greenhelg rescued a wounded para in a night battle in the dark and in cold and windy weather. He flew the Scout, picked the para up and took him back to the field hospital in Ajax Bay, saving his life, and he was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross for that mission. So the Scout was an Airfix Scout, so it's quite an old kit now. Took a lot of work to get it up to speed. I bought a few different air graphics sets, including the stretcher pods, the engine detail set, and the bulge door set. And I also used the Airwaves etched set for the interior to make that a bit more detailed. The original kit really doesn't have very good detail inside. Also add a lot of wire to the engine to make it look realistic. It's taken me sort of about a year, having finished the original group build. I carried on making and sort of bought various books and magazines, and I read various articles and stuff online to find out more information about the less well-known sort of aircraft and missions that were flown during the Falklands War. I think this particular book is the one that I'd recommend as the most information. It's got a sort of day-by-day diary outlining the different missions and aircraft codes and stuff. So it's got the most sort of useful data in it in terms of trying to work out information about particular aircraft and stuff. So that was probably the best find so far that I've found. But yeah, it's been an interesting journey, sort of making these models over the last year, and taking these kits and sort of modifying them and making them try and look as accurate as possible for the aircraft from this conflict. But yeah, feel like I've done an all right job of getting something close to what they would have been. Anyway, thank you for watching. Bye.